Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Dodge City. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard the story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the fading light of October 1891, Dodge City, Kansas, was no longer the wild frontier town of legend. The railroad had tamed it somewhat. The infamous Front Street had quieted. Many saloons had closed their doors as the cattle drives changed routes. But one establishment remained, stubbornly perched at the edge of town, its windows illuminated well past midnight. The Vermilion Rose Saloon stood as a remnant of a bygone era, a two-story wooden structure with peeling red paint and a sign that creaked in the prairie wind. What transpired within those walls would only come to light years later, when a leather-bound ledger was discovered during the demolition of the building in 1961. The ledger contained detailed accounts written by Dr. Edmund Thurston, the only physician in Dodge City during that time. His entries began innocuously enough, documenting visits to the saloon for social purposes. However, as the pages progressed, the entries became increasingly disturbing. The ledger was immediately sealed by local authorities and transferred to state archives, where it remained largely forgotten until a graduate student from Kansas State University stumbled upon a reference to it in 1968. By then, those involved were long deceased, and the truth had been buried alongside them. What follows is a reconstruction of events based on Dr. Thurston's ledger, newspaper archives from the Dodge City Globe, county records, and interviews conducted with descendants of Dodge City residents in the early 1960s. Some names have been changed to protect the identities of families still residing in the area. The events described herein occurred over a period of approximately 7 months, from October 1891 to April 1892. The Vermilion Rose was owned by a widow named Eleanor Blackwood, who had arrived in Dodge City in the spring of 1889. According to town records, she purchased the establishment from a retiring saloon keeper named Jeremiah Walsh. What made the transaction unusual was the substantial sum paid, nearly 3 times the property's value. This detail went largely unnoticed at the time, but would later become significant as events unfolded. Eleanor Blackwood was described in Dr. Thurston's ledger as a woman of indeterminate age, perhaps in her late 30s, with striking features that suggest European ancestry. Her composure remains unshakable even in the most chaotic moments of frontier revelry. She kept mostly to herself, managing the business affairs while employing local women to serve drinks and provide company to patrons. Unlike other establishments of its kind, the Vermilion Rose maintained an air of respectability. No brawls were tolerated, no excessive drunkenness permitted. Those who broke the rules were not merely thrown out, they were never welcomed back. Thurston notes in his earliest entries about the establishment that Eleanor Blackwood had an uncanny ability to assess a man's worth, not merely his character, but his financial and social standing, within moments of his entering the Vermilion Rose. She seemed to instinctively know which patrons deserved attention and which were merely passing through. This selective approach to customer service was unusual for a frontier saloon where typically any man with coins to spend was welcomed until he caused trouble. The saloon employed 5 women when our account begins. Their names, according to the ledger, were Vivian Hayes, Catherine Miller, Josephine Delaney, Margaret Wilson, and Sarah Bennett. Each had arrived in Dodge City under different circumstances, but all had found employment at the Vermilion Rose when other options had dried up. The women lived in rooms on the 2nd floor of the establishment. They were rarely seen in town during daylight hours, conducting their personal business at dusk, when most townsfolk were returning home for supper. Vivian Hayes was the youngest, described as being in her early 20s with auburn hair and a reserved demeanor. She had arrived in Dodge City on the eastbound train from California in the summer of 1890, reportedly fleeing an unfortunate marriage. She spoke little of her past, though Thurston noted she occasionally mentioned San Francisco with a wistful tone. Catherine Miller was older, perhaps 30, with striking blonde hair and what Thurston described as an air of faded gentility. She claimed to be the widow of a Union officer, though no record of such a marriage could be found when researchers later investigated her background. She was well educated, often reading books in French and German between serving customers. Josephine Delaney had the bearing of a woman who had seen much hardship. Dark-haired and slender, she spoke with a slight Irish accent, and kept to herself even among her fellow employees. Thurston's notes suggest she may have worked previously in similar establishments in Wichita and Abilene before settling in Dodge City. Margaret Wilson was the most recently hired, having joined the Vermilion Rose staff just weeks before our account begins. A woman in her mid-20s with mousy brown hair and a nervous disposition, she had previously worked as a seamstress until an injury to her right hand made fine needlework impossible. Eleanor Blackwood had offered her employment when no one else would. Sarah Bennett was perhaps the most mysterious of the women. Tall and statuesque with raven hair, she rarely spoke above a whisper. Rumors in town suggested she had once been married to a wealthy rancher who had died under suspicious circumstances, though no one could say which ranch or provide a name. She had a peculiar habit of staring into space for minutes at a time, as if seeing things others could not. A peculiar pattern emerged in October 1891. Several men who had been regular patrons of the Vermilion Rose suddenly left town without notice. In a frontier town like Dodge City, such departures weren't uncommon. Men came and went with the seasons, following work or running from troubles elsewhere. But what drew Dr. Thurston's attention was that these particular men had established themselves in the community. They owned businesses, had accounts at the bank, and had spoken of future plans in town. Their sudden disappearances left affairs unsettled. The first to vanish was Harold Jenkins, a cattle broker who had amassed considerable wealth during the boom years of the cattle trade. Jenkins had purchased a substantial property on the outskirts of town just weeks before his disappearance, and had contracted builders to construct what would have been one of the finest houses in Ford County. He was last seen entering the Vermilion Rose on the evening of October 12, 1891. His horse was found the next morning still tethered outside the saloon. When questioned by Marshal William Davidson, Eleanor Blackwood stated that Jenkins had received an urgent telegram and had decided to take the midnight train to Kansas City. He produced a hastily written note, allegedly from Jenkins, instructing her to care for his horse until his return in a fortnight. That return never came. Thomas Grady, the telegraph operator, vanished just 1 week later. Grady was a meticulous man who had operated the Dodge City telegraph office for nearly a decade. He was known for his reliability and adherence to schedule. His absence was noted immediately when he failed to open the office on the morning of October 20th. A clerk from the railroad office who went to check on him found his quarters above the telegraph office undisturbed, his bed unslept in. Grady had last been seen drinking at the Vermilion Rose the previous evening, engaged in conversation with Sarah Bennett. Frank Morrison, the blacksmith, disappeared on November 3rd. A large, powerful man known for his skill with metal and his booming laugh, Morrison had recently become engaged to a young woman from a neighboring farm. He had told friends he was saving for a wedding planned for the spring. On the night of his disappearance, he had gone to the Vermilion Rose to celebrate a particularly profitable week at his forge. According to Eleanor Blackwood, Morrison had mentioned heading south to seek opportunities in Texas. His fiancée insisted this was impossible. They had finalized their wedding plans just days before. According to the Ford County Register, between October and December 1891, 7 men were reported missing. In addition to Jenkins, Grady, and Morrison, there was Robert Parker, a merchant who owned a dry goods store, Samuel Wilson, a land surveyor, George Thompson, a banker's clerk, and James Miller, a lawyer who had recently moved to Dodge City from St. Louis. All were last seen at the Vermilion Rose. All disappeared without collecting debts owed to them, without saying goodbye to close associates, and without withdrawing their savings from the bank. When questioned by the town marshal about these disappearances, Eleanor Blackwood reportedly stated that the men had mentioned heading to Oklahoma Territory, where new land opportunities had opened up. This explanation seemed plausible on the surface. The Oklahoma land rush had indeed drawn many men seeking fortunes, but the pattern of departures without financial preparations struck many as odd. What made Dr. Thurston suspicious was that none of these men had withdrawn significant funds from their accounts at the First National Bank of Dodge City. The bank manager, Albert Preston, confided this information to Thurston during a medical appointment in late November. Preston had found it peculiar that men planning to start anew elsewhere would leave their savings behind. This conversation prompted Thurston to begin keeping his detailed record of observations. In an entry dated November 27, 1891, Thurston wrote, "I am increasingly troubled by the exodus of prominent men from our community, all seemingly connected to their patronage of the Vermilion Rose. While Dodge City has never been a stranger to sudden departures, the circumstances surrounding these particular cases strike me as abnormal. These were not drifters or cowboys passing through. These were established men with roots in the community. Their simultaneous abandonment of property, relationships, and financial assets defies rational explanation." The doctor was a frequent visitor to the Vermilion Rose, though his ledger insisted his interest was purely observational. He described a strange atmosphere that had descended upon the place by early December. The piano that once played lively tunes now sat silent most evenings. The women spoke in hushed tones and exchanged glances that seemed laden with unspoken meaning. And Eleanor Blackwood watched everything from behind the bar, her expression revealing nothing. Thurston noted in his December 2nd entry, "The Rose has changed. It is as if a shadow has fallen over the establishment. The women move differently now, more deliberately, with an odd synchronicity. When one turns, another seems to anticipate the movement. When one speaks, another falls silent, as if to create space for the words. Eleanor watches them constantly, her eyes following their movements with an intensity that borders on predatory. I am reminded of a conductor directing an orchestra, or perhaps more accurately, a spider monitoring the vibrations of its web." On December 5, 1891, Thurston noted something unusual. A patron named William Cooper, a cattle driver passing through town, had become visibly ill after drinking at the Vermilion Rose. Thurston, who happened to be present, offered his medical assistance. Cooper described a bitter aftertaste to his whiskey and a strange numbness in his extremities. Before Thurston could examine him further, Eleanor and two of the women, Josephine and Catherine, insisted on taking Cooper upstairs to rest. Thurston was firmly told his services were not required. Thurston writes, "Cooper's condition deteriorated with alarming rapidity. Within minutes of consuming his drink, he began to exhibit symptoms consistent with certain alkaloid compounds I have encountered in medical literature: dilated pupils, profuse sweating, disorientation. When I attempted to examine him, Eleanor intercepted me with unusual force, stating, 'We have remedies upstairs for such spells. They often affect men unaccustomed to the altitude and dust of our region.' Her explanation was medically unsound, yet delivered with such authority that other patrons accepted it without question. Cooper was half carried, half dragged up the staircase by Josephine and Catherine. His eyes, when they briefly met mine, held an expression of profound terror. The following morning, Cooper was gone. His horse remained in the livery stable, his possessions still in his room at the boarding house. When questioned by the town marshal, Eleanor Blackwood produced a note, supposedly written by Cooper, claiming he had decided to catch the eastbound train to Kansas City after receiving an urgent message. The handwriting, according to Thurston, who viewed the note, appeared strained and irregular, as if written by a hand unaccustomed to the task or under duress. "I have examined several of these supposed farewell notes now," Thurston wrote on December 8th. They share certain characteristics that trouble me deeply. The handwriting in each bears only a passing resemblance to known samples from the missing men. The language is uniformly terse and practical, devoid of personal sentiment. One would expect in communications to colleagues and loved ones. Most telling is that they all employ similar phrasing, as if dictated by a single author attempting to imitate different hands. I cannot shake the conviction that these men did not write these notes, and perhaps did not leave town of their own volition. By January 1892, a pall had fallen over the Vermilion Rose. Business continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The women no longer smiled or laughed with patrons. They served drinks efficiently, engaged in minimal conversation, and frequently disappeared upstairs for long periods. Eleanor Blackwood began spending more time in the basement, a space supposedly used for storage. Deliveries of unusual items began arriving, large quantities of quicklime, barrels of unidentified liquids, and crates that required multiple men to carry. Thurston observed these deliveries from his office window across the street. He noted, "Today marked the third delivery this month of substantial quantities of quicklime to the Vermilion Rose. Such quantities far exceed what would be required for any legitimate purpose in a saloon. The delivery men are always the same two individuals, neither of whom I recognize as Dodge City residents. They arrive before dawn, complete their task with unusual haste, and depart immediately. Eleanor Blackwood personally supervises each delivery, exchanging few words with the men. Once I observed her hand them a small package, which they received with expressions suggesting remuneration beyond the usual payment for services." The doctor's suspicions deepened when he noticed structural modifications being made to the saloon. Additional ventilation shafts appeared on the roof, though no renovations had been publicly announced. Heavy curtains were installed over all windows, preventing any view into the establishment from the street. Most concerning was the installation of a new door to the basement, a heavy iron affair with multiple locks, replacing the simple wooden door that had existed previously. A revealing entry in Thurston's ledger, dated January 17, 1892, reads, "I have observed E.B. consulting a leather-bound volume of considerable age. The text appears to be in a language unfamiliar to me, possibly Latin or Greek, though the alphabet seems somehow distorted. The women gather around her as she reads, nodding as if receiving instructions. When I approached, the book was hastily concealed, and their manner became instantly guarded." Thurston began to take note of the patrons who received special attention from Eleanor and her employees. A pattern emerged. The men who disappeared had all been relatively wealthy, physically robust, and without close family ties in Dodge City. They were men whose absences would be noted, but perhaps not immediately investigated with vigor. They were also men who would not be easily overpowered or coerced, suggesting that whatever method was used to subdue them was subtle and effective. The doctor's January entries detail his growing unease with the changes in the women employed at the Vermilion Rose. He noted that their physical appearances remained the same, but their mannerisms, speech patterns, and even their gaits had altered subtly. "It is as if they are wearing their bodies like ill-fitting garments," he wrote on January 23rd. "Their movements lack the natural fluidity one expects in young women. They pause before responding to questions, as if translating their thoughts into English from some other language. Most disturbing is their vacant expression when not actively engaged with patrons, a stillness of feature that suggests absence rather than repose." Thurston began to monitor the women when they ventured into town. He noted they now moved in pairs, never alone. They purchased unusual items, exotic herbs from the apothecary, specific minerals from the assay office, odd mechanical components from the hardware merchant. They avoided all personal interactions beyond what was necessary to complete their transactions. When addressed by former acquaintances, they responded with minimal courtesy before extracting themselves from the conversation. The most disturbing accounts begin in February. Thurston described witnessing Catherine Miller experiencing what appeared to be a seizure while serving drinks. Her eyes rolled back, her limbs stiffened, and she began speaking in a voice unlike her own, deeper, with an accent Thurston could not place. The words were incomprehensible to him, but Eleanor Blackwood responded to whatever was said with visible alarm. Catherine was immediately taken upstairs and did not reappear for 3 days. When she returned to work, she moved differently, as if her joints had been reconfigured. Her once warm demeanor had been replaced by cold efficiency. "The incident with Catherine Miller defies medical explanation," wrote Thurston on February 9th. "The seizure, if that is indeed what it was, presented symptoms inconsistent with epilepsy or other nervous disorders with which I am familiar. Her vocalization during the episode was not the typical, unintelligible sounds of a seizure patient, but structured speech in a language unknown to me. Most inexplicable was Eleanor Blackwood's reaction, not concern, as one would expect for a person in medical distress, but intense interest, as if Catherine were conveying information of vital importance. When Catherine returned to her duties days later, she appeared physically identical, yet fundamentally changed in essence. She now moves with mechanical precision, her former grace replaced by efficient, economical movements. Her voice, once melodious, now possesses a metallic quality that sets my nerves on edge. I am faced with the disturbing possibility that whatever return to work at the Vermilion Rose is not in some essential way Catherine Miller." Similar incidents occurred with the other women over subsequent weeks. Each would disappear for days at a time, then return altered in subtle but unmistakable ways. Their voices changed pitch, their gaits became uneven, their eyes seemed to focus on points in space where nothing was visible. By late February, all 5 women had experienced this transformation. They now moved in perfect coordination, like performers in a macabre ballet. They no longer ate or drank in public. They did not blink with normal human frequency. Thurston's curiosity led him to follow Josephine Delaney one evening in late February when she left the saloon to run an errand. She walked to the telegraph office, now operated by a new clerk since Thomas Grady's disappearance. Josephine handed over a telegram, paid, and left. Using his position as town physician, Thurston later convinced the young telegraph operator to reveal the contents of the message. It had been addressed to someone in New Orleans and contained only a series of numbers, 7-3-19-8-2-1511. The telegram's content, mere numbers without context, suggests a code, Thurston wrote. The recipient in New Orleans is listed simply as Harwood, no initial or address beyond the city name. The young operator informed me that Josephine has sent similar telegrams weekly since January, always numbers, always to the same recipient. I am convinced these communications are coordinating some larger operation extending beyond Dodge City. The precision and regularity suggest planning on a scale that chills my blood. On March 3rd, a stranger arrived in Dodge City. Thurston described him as extraordinarily tall and thin, with hollow cheeks and eyes set too deeply within their sockets. He wears the attire of an Eastern gentleman, though the cut of his clothing seems oddly antiquated. The stranger took a room at the Dodge House Hotel, but spent every evening at the Vermilion Rose, engaged in lengthy conversations with Eleanor Blackwood. He never drank, never engaged with the other patrons, and left precisely at midnight each night. The stranger, who identified himself as Professor James Harwood, claimed to be conducting research on frontier settlements for an academic institution back east. However, Thurston noted that Harwood showed no interest in the usual historical sites or local figures of importance. His focus remained exclusively on the Vermilion Rose and its occupants. Harwood's arrival coincided with a noticeable increase in activity at the saloon. Deliveries became more frequent. The basement door opened and closed at all hours of the night. Strange sounds, mechanical whirrings and rhythmic thumpings, emanated from the building after closing hours. Lights could be seen moving behind the curtained windows well into the early morning hours. Thurston made discreet inquiries about Professor Harwood, telegraphing colleagues at medical schools in Boston New York, and Philadelphia. None had heard of a researcher by that name. No academic publications bore his signature. No university claimed him as faculty. Harwood appeared to have materialized out of thin air, his credentials as insubstantial as morning mist. "I observed Harwood and Eleanor Blackwood today through my field glasses," wrote Thurston on March 10th. "They were examining architectural diagrams spread across a table in the otherwise empty saloon. The drawings appeared to depict some sort of mechanical apparatus, pipes, chambers, and what resembled surgical equipment. They spoke with great animation, occasionally gesturing to various parts of the diagram. At one point, Harwood produced a small device from his waistcoat, a metallic object that caught the light strangely. Eleanor examined it with evident satisfaction before placing it in a small case. Their collaboration has the character not of academic colleagues, but of conspirators advancing a shared objective. By mid-March, the behavior of Eleanor Blackwood and her employees had become so peculiar that even the least observant townsfolk began to take notice. The women were seldom seen during daylight hours. When they did appear in town, they wore veils despite the season. They spoke only when necessary, their voices barely above whispers. They seemed to move in perfect unison, like parts of a single organism. Rumors began to circulate through Dodge City. Some claimed the women were ill with some exotic disease. Others suggested they had joined a strange religious sect. A few whispered about witchcraft, though such talk was quickly dismissed as superstitious nonsense by the more educated residents. Marshal Davidson, when approached about investigating the Vermilion Rose, brushed off concerns, stating that unusual behavior ain't a crime. Thurston noted with interest that the marshal had stopped visiting the Vermilion Rose since January, after being a regular patron for years. The most alarming entry in Thurston's ledger is dated March 21, 1892. He had stayed at the saloon until closing, feigning intoxication to avoid being ushered out. Concealing himself beneath a table, he witnessed Eleanor Blackwood and Professor Harwood engage in a ritual of some kind after the establishment had emptied. The 5 women formed a circle around them as they chanted in alternating voices, creating a rhythm that Thurston described as discordant yet hypnotic, like the sound of multiple timepieces ticking at slightly different intervals. "What I witnessed defies rational explanation," Thurston wrote in shaky script. The floor of the saloon was cleared of furniture, revealing a pattern inlaid in the wooden planks, a complex geometric design previously hidden beneath the scatter of tables and chairs. At each point of intersection in this design, small metal objects were placed, identical to the device I had seen Harwood show to Eleanor days before. The women positioned themselves at the perimeter of this pattern, equidistant from one another, their arms extended outward. Eleanor and Harwood stood at the center, facing each other. As the ritual progressed, Thurston observed that the women began to exhibit physical distress. Their skin grew pallid, their breathing labored. Vivian Hayes collapsed first, followed by Sarah Bennett. Eleanor Blackwood and the professor continued their chanting, seemingly unconcerned by the women's condition. Then, most disturbing of all, Thurston witnessed what he could only describe as a transference. Something seemed to pass from the fallen women to Eleanor, a vapor or essence that moved through the air in defiance of natural laws. "I cannot trust my own perception of what followed," Thurston's account continues. "The air between the fallen women and Eleanor Blackwood appeared to ripple, as if heat were distorting my vision. Yet the room was cold, unnaturally so, my breath visible in the air. A luminescence that I can only describe as a negative light, a darkness that somehow illuminated, passed from the women's parted lips to Eleanor's outstretched hands. She convulsed as this essence entered her, her body arching backward at an angle physically impossible, without injury to the spine. Throughout this grotesque display, Harwood continued his chant, now at a higher pitch and faster tempo. The metal devices at the pattern's intersections began to vibrate, emitting a tone that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The remaining women, Catherine, Josephine, and Margaret, swayed in unison, their movements no longer human in quality, but mechanical, like automata, responding to some invisible mechanism. The ritual concluded with Eleanor producing a small silver knife. She made incisions on the forearms of the unconscious women, collecting their blood in a brass bowl. Professor Harwood added some powder from a vial he carried, creating a mixture that Eleanor then consumed. The remaining women, Catherine, Josephine, and Margaret, were then instructed to drag their unconscious colleagues upstairs. Thurston managed to slip out undetected during this commotion. His handwriting in this entry is noticeably disturbed, the script jagged and hurried. He questions his own sanity, wondering if he had been drugged or if his mind was fabricating impossible scenarios. He resolves to gather evidence before approaching the authorities, knowing that his account would be dismissed without proof. "I must consider the possibility that I was somehow drugged," he wrote. "Perhaps something in the whiskey I consumed affected my perception. Yet my mind remains clear on the details, and my medical training has taught me to observe with precision even in extraordinary circumstances. If what I witnessed was real, and God help us all if it was, then Eleanor Blackwood and this so-called professor are practicing arts beyond the bounds of natural science. The implications are too terrible to contemplate without corroborating evidence. I shall observe with even greater diligence and seek tangible proof before taking action." The following day, Vivian Hayes and Sarah Bennett were seen working in the saloon as if nothing had happened. Thurston noted, however, that they now moved with the same unnatural coordination he had observed in the others after their transformations. Their eyes held the same vacant quality, their voices the same hollow timbre. When they served drinks, their hands no longer trembled with human imprecision, but moved with mechanical exactitude. They did not engage in conversation unless directly addressed, and when they did speak, their words seemed rehearsed, lacking the spontaneity of natural discourse. Thurston began to compile a dossier on Eleanor Blackwood, gathering what information he could about her background. He discovered that before appearing in Dodge City, she had operated similar establishments in other frontier towns: Tombstone, Arizona, in 1885, Deadwood, South Dakota, in 1880, and Cheyenne, Wyoming, in 1875. In each location, her stay had been brief, 2 to 3 years, and her departure had coincided with unexplained disappearances. Yet in each case, the Eleanor Blackwood described in local records was reported to be a woman in her 30s, despite the passage of years that should have aged her considerably. Most disturbing was Thurston's discovery of a newspaper clipping from New Orleans dated 1857, describing the mysterious closure of a high-end brothel called the Scarlet Chamber. The establishment's proprietress, named as Eleonora Black, had vanished overnight, along with 5 female employees. The article mentioned that several wealthy patrons had gone missing in the months prior to the brothel's closure. An accompanying illustration depicted Eleonora Black, with features identical to Eleanor Blackwood, despite the 35-year gap between the article and Thurston's observations. "I am forced to consider possibilities that contradict all scientific knowledge," Thurston wrote on March 30th. "Either Eleanor Blackwood is the descendant of the woman depicted in this illustration, bearing an uncanny resemblance to her ancestor, or she is somehow the same individual, unchanged by the passage of decades. The latter possibility suggests either an elaborate deception involving multiple women of similar appearance or something far more sinister, a means of arresting the aging process through methods beyond current medical understanding." Determined to uncover what was truly happening, Thurston devised a plan. He began cultivating a closer relationship with Margaret Wilson, who seemed the least affected by whatever influence Eleanor Blackwood exerted over the women. Under the pretext of treating a persistent cough, he arranged private consultations with Margaret, gradually gaining her trust. Margaret Wilson retains more of her original personality than the others, he noted on April 2nd. Her transformation appears incomplete when separate from her companions, Brief flashes of her former self emerge, momentary expressions of confusion or distress that quickly subside. She has begun to speak to me more openly during our consultations, though she frequently glances toward the door as if fearing interruption. Today she mentioned having dreams of floating outside herself, observing her own body from above as it moved without her direction. She described these not as dreams, but as memories, insisting they had actually occurred. Her hands trembled as she spoke, the first genuine human movement I have observed in any of the women for weeks. In early April, Margaret finally confided in him. Her account, as recorded by Thurston, was fragmented and often incoherent, but certain details emerged with clarity. She spoke of Eleanor Blackwood's true identity, not a widow from elsewhere in the territory, but something far more sinister. According to Margaret, Eleanor had lived many lives, worn many faces. She possessed knowledge of ancient practices that allowed her to sustain herself through means most would consider impossible. Margaret spoke today with increasing agitation, Thurston wrote on April 5th. She claims Eleanor is not human, not in the way we understand humanity. She described her as a vessel that has existed for centuries, transferring her consciousness from body to body when her current form begins to fail. The process requires specific conditions and components: a prepared host, various chemical compounds, and, most disturbingly, the life essence of healthy males. Margaret believes the missing men were not killed in the conventional sense, but consumed through a process that extracts some vital energy or essence necessary for Eleanor's transfers. The women of the Vermilion Rose were not merely employees, but vessels. Eleanor selected them carefully, choosing those with specific qualities: resilience, adaptability, and a desperate need for security that would ensure their loyalty. According to Margaret, Eleanor gradually altered the women through regular administration of compounds that made them more receptive to her influence. The final stage involved a ritual that created a connection between Eleanor's consciousness and theirs, allowing her to partially inhabit their bodies and control their actions. Margaret describes a horrifying symbiosis, Thurston recorded. Eleanor exists simultaneously within her own body and within the bodies of her prepared women. She experiences through their senses, controls their actions when necessary, and uses them as extensions of herself. This explains the coordinated movements I have observed, the shared mannerisms, the identical phrasing. They are not 5 separate women, but appendages of a single consciousness, housed primarily within Eleanor. Margaret says her own will reasserts itself occasionally, particularly when Eleanor is focused elsewhere, which explains her ability to speak with me now. She fears this freedom is temporary and diminishing daily. Most disturbing was Margaret's revelation about Professor Harwood. He was not a professor at all, but a practitioner of the same dark arts as Eleanor. They had known each other for decades, possibly centuries, meeting periodically across different locations to exchange knowledge and perform ceremonies that sustained their unnatural existence. Harwood, according to Margaret, specialized in creating the mechanical components necessary for their rituals, devices that somehow facilitated the transfer of consciousness and life essence between bodies. Margaret claims Harwood has existed even longer than Eleanor, wrote Thurston. She overheard them discussing events from the 16th century, as if they had witnessed them personally. They spoke of techniques refined over centuries, of failed transfers and successful ones. They referred to previous collections of women in various locations throughout history. Most chilling was their casual reference to people as materials or components, with no more sentiment than a carpenter might express toward wood or nails. Margaret believes they view humanity as mere resources for their continued existence, objects to be used and discarded when their utility is exhausted. Margaret's final confession concerned the basement of the Vermilion Rose. What Eleanor claimed was storage space was actually a chamber where the most terrible rituals took place. The deliveries of quicklime and chemicals were for disposing of evidence. The basement floor had been excavated to create a deep pit where remains could be dissolved without trace. Most horrifying were the devices Harwood had installed there, mechanical contrivances that combined principles of chemistry, medicine, and something Margaret called ethereal science, designed to extract and transfer the essential life force from one being to another. Margaret's description of the basement laboratory exceeds the worst nightmares of Gothic fiction, Thurston wrote, his usually meticulous script now barely legible. She speaks of glass vessels containing preserved organs, of mechanical pumps that circulate fluids between bodies, of electrical apparatus that stimulates nerves and muscles in cadavers. The missing men are indeed dead, their bodies used in experiments and rituals before being dissolved in chemical baths. Yet something of them persists, some essence or energy harvested during the process and stored in special containers Harwood designed. Eleanor and Harwood consume this essence periodically to maintain their unnatural longevity. The women serve as both assistants in this process and as potential future vessels should Eleanor's current body begin to fail. Margaret warned Thurston that she and the other women were beyond saving. The process of transformation was irreversible once completed. She urged him to flee Dodge City immediately, to take his evidence to federal authorities rather than local law enforcement, which she claimed had been compromised. She believed Eleanor could sense their conversation through the partial connection they shared and feared severe consequences for her betrayal. Margaret concluded our meeting with a warning that haunts me, Thurston wrote. She said, "When you look at us now, you see 5 women and Eleanor. But there is only Eleanor, the rest are shadows, puppets, extensions. Soon I will fade completely, as the others have. My last independent act is this warning. Run, Doctor. Run far from here. They have noticed your interest, and you are already marked as the next acquisition." I tried to convince her to flee with me, but she merely smiled sadly and said, "I cannot leave. I am no longer entirely here to leave." The next day, Margaret Wilson was seen working in the saloon, her movements now in perfect synchronization with the other women. When Thurston attempted to speak with her, she responded with the same vacant expression and mechanical precision he had observed in the others. There was no recognition in her eyes, no hint of the woman who had confided in him the previous day. It was as if their conversation had never occurred, or as if the Margaret Wilson who had spoken to him no longer existed within the body that bore her name. Thurston's last coherent entry is dated April 12, 1892. He had resolved to gather physical evidence from the basement of the Vermilion Rose. He planned to enter the establishment after hours through a window he had identified as having a faulty latch. Once inside, he would descend to the basement, document what he found, and take his evidence directly to the county sheriff rather than the town marshal, whom he suspected might be under Eleanor's influence. "I have prepared as thoroughly as circumstances allow," he wrote. "I carry with me a small camera with magnesium flash powder to document what I find. I have a vial of chloroform should I need to render someone unconscious. I wear rubber-soled shoes to minimize noise. I have left sealed letters with 3 trusted colleagues in different cities, to be opened in the event of my disappearance, detailing my suspicions and the location of this ledger. If what Margaret told me is accurate, I am facing something beyond conventional human malevolence, something that has refined its predatory nature over centuries. Yet I cannot in good conscience flee without attempting to gather evidence that might convince authorities to act. Too many have already disappeared. If I do not return from this undertaking, may whoever reads this account be wiser or braver than I." The entry ends with Thurston writing, "Should I not return from this undertaking, let this ledger serve as testament to what transpires in our midst. I go not out of foolish bravery, but out of duty to truth, and to those who have already been lost. May God have mercy on my soul, for I fear Eleanor Blackwood will not." The next several pages of the ledger are blank, then in different handwriting, identified by graphologists in the 1960s as belonging to Eleanor Blackwood, based on comparison with business documents bearing her signature, appears a single entry. Dr. Thurston has joined us in understanding. His medical knowledge proves most valuable. The good doctor no longer questions our methods, having experienced their efficacy firsthand. He sends his regrets to those who might wonder at his sudden change in perspective. His previous entries in this ledger reflect a mind struggling with concepts beyond its training, impressions filtered through fear and conventional morality. He now comprehends the necessity and elegance of our work. The doctor will assist in our relocation to Denver, where urban growth provides greater resources and privacy for our continued studies. This ledger, with its misguided speculations, shall be sealed away as a curiosity, perhaps to be rediscovered long after all concerned have transcended their current circumstances. Town records indicate that Dr. Edmund Thurston continued to practice medicine in Dodge City until 1896, when he relocated to Denver with Eleanor Blackwood and the women of the Vermilion Rose. The saloon was sold to new owners who operated it as a respectable establishment until Prohibition. Locals reported that in the years between his nighttime investigation and his departure, Thurston changed dramatically. Once gregarious and deeply involved in community affairs, he became withdrawn and cold. He reduced his practice to a few select patients and spent most evenings at the Vermilion Rose. He was often seen in deep conversation with Professor Harwood, examining technical drawings and making notes in a shared journal. Most telling was his eyes, described by former friends as vacant and somehow not his own. No record exists of Thurston or any of the women after their departure from Dodge City. Professor Harwood seemingly vanished from historical record entirely. Attempts by later researchers to trace their movements through Denver City directories and medical registries proved fruitless. It was as if they had disappeared into the growing anonymity of urban America at the turn of the century. The Vermilion Rose building changed hands multiple times over the decades until it was slated for demolition in 1961 to make way for modern development. During this process, workers discovered a sealed chamber beneath the basement floor, a room whose existence was not indicated in any architectural plans. The chamber contained Thurston's ledger, along with several other artifacts: silver implements of unknown purpose, glass vials containing dried residue, and a leather-bound book written in a language no linguistic expert could identify. The sealed chamber measured approximately 15 by 20 feet, with walls lined with a metallic material later identified as a lead-copper alloy. The floor featured an intricate inlaid pattern similar to what Thurston had described seeing in the saloon during the ritual he witnessed. At the center was a stone table with restraints attached at intervals. Channels carved into the table's surface led to collection vessels positioned at its base. The entire arrangement suggested a purpose too disturbing to articulate in official reports. Most disturbing of all was a collection of personal effects belonging to the 7 men who had disappeared in 1891-92. Pocket watches, wedding rings, monogrammed cufflinks, all meticulously labeled and stored in individual boxes lined with lead. These items were removed by authorities and held as evidence in an investigation that was ultimately abandoned due to the passage of time and lack of living witnesses. Also discovered in the chamber were glass photographic plates showing what appeared to be medical experiments. The images were badly degraded, but experts who examined them described scenes consistent with surgical procedures performed under questionable circumstances. Several plates showed what appeared to be Dr. Thurston himself apparently participating in these procedures. His expression in these images was described as utterly devoid of emotion or humanity. The graduate student who rediscovered Thurston's ledger in 1968 attempted to trace the subsequent movements of Eleanor Blackwood and her companions. The trail led to Denver, then Salt Lake City, then San Francisco, before going cold in 1920. However, newspaper archives from these locations contain reports of similar disappearances, successful men who vanished without withdrawing their savings, leaving their affairs in disarray. In Denver, between 1897 and 1903, 5 prominent citizens disappeared under circumstances reminiscent of the Dodge City cases. All were last seen at an exclusive private club operated by Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood Thurston, described as the wife of Dr. Edmund Thurston. The club, called the Crimson Chamber, catered to the city's elite. It closed suddenly in 1903, its proprietors departing without notice. In Salt Lake City from 1904 to 1908, a similar pattern emerged surrounding an establishment called the Macabre Saloon, owned by a woman identified in business records as Eleanora Black. Once again, several wealthy men disappeared after becoming regular patrons. Once again, the establishment closed abruptly, its owner and staff vanishing overnight. San Francisco records from 1909 to 1919 mention an exclusive social club called the Scarlet Room, operated by Madame Eleanor, who was described in society columns as a striking woman of indeterminate age with the bearing of European aristocracy. The 1906 earthquake and subsequent fire destroyed many records from this period, but surviving newspaper accounts mention at least 7 unexplained disappearances of prominent men connected to the establishment. The Scarlet Room closed in 1919, just as Prohibition loomed on the horizon. More intriguing still are the scattered reports of women matching the descriptions of those who worked at the Vermilion Rose, appearing in photographs taken decades after they should have aged or died. A woman bearing a striking resemblance to Catherine Miller appears in a 1927 photograph taken at a San Francisco opera gala. A woman who could be Josephine Delaney is visible in the background of a 1935 newspaper photograph documenting a New Orleans society function. And perhaps most chilling, a woman who appears identical to Eleanor Blackwood can be seen in a 1958 photograph taken at an art exhibition in New York City. In each instance, the women appear unchanged, as if time had no effect on them. They wear the fashions of their respective eras, but retain the same features documented in descriptions from 1891. When this pattern was discovered in 1968, attempts were made to locate these women, but no trace could be found. It was as if they had vanished once again, moving on to new identities and new locations. The final piece of this disturbing puzzle emerged in 1965, when an elderly man named William Cooper, sharing the same name as the cattle driver who had fallen ill at the Vermilion Rose in December 1891, was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Chicago. His age did not align with that of the original William Cooper, who would have been well over 100 years old by then. However, this William Cooper claimed to be the very same man, insisting he had been held captive for decades before escaping. His account included details about the Vermilion Rose that matched Thurston's ledger exactly, despite the ledger not having been made public at that time. According to hospital records, Cooper spoke of women who could transfer their consciousness between bodies, of ancient rituals that extended life well beyond natural limits, and of a basement chamber where unspeakable acts were performed. Most staff dismissed his claims as the ravings of a delusional mind. However, one psychiatrist, Dr. Rebecca Langley, took detailed notes, recognizing specific details that aligned with historical records from Dodge City. Cooper claimed to have been kept in a semi-conscious state for decades, his body used for periodic harvesting of what he called life essence. He described being moved multiple times to different locations as Eleanor Blackwood and her associates relocated. Most recently, he said, he had been kept in a private facility outside Chicago where he was maintained, along with other donors, in a state of suspended animation. He had escaped during a rare moment when his guards were distracted, breaking a window and fleeing into the night. Dr. Langley's notes document Cooper's description of the process. The patient claims that approximately once per month he would be removed from his suspended state and connected to what he describes as a machine like a metal spider. This device would apparently extract something from him, not blood, he insists, but something less tangible that he struggles to define. After each extraction, he would feel depleted for days before gradually recovering. He believes this process had been ongoing since 1891, with his consciousness somehow prevented from fully experiencing the passage of time. When asked how he could possibly have survived such treatment for over 70 years, he responded with disturbing calm. "They need us alive to feed. Dead men provide nothing of value to them." Cooper died in the hospital in 1966, never having been released. His body was claimed by a woman who identified herself as his niece. Hospital staff later recalled that the woman was striking in appearance, with an old-world composure that seemed out of place in modern Chicago. She provided all necessary documentation, and Cooper's body was released into her custody. No record exists of where he was buried. Dr. Langley attempted to follow up on Cooper's claims, investigating the location he had described escaping from. She found an abandoned medical facility that matched his description, but it had been emptied completely, with no evidence remaining of its former purpose. When she tried to access Cooper's hospital records to continue her research, she discovered they had been removed from the archives. Her own notes, which she had kept in a separate location, became the only remaining documentation of Cooper's testimony. The graduate student who had been researching this case, Michael Reynolds, disappeared in 1968, shortly after publishing an initial paper on the Vermilion Rose incidents in an obscure historical journal. His apartment was found in perfect order, with no sign of struggle or hasty departure. His research notes were missing. Colleagues reported that in the weeks before his disappearance, he had mentioned being followed by a tall, thin man in outdated clothing and receiving phone calls where the caller remained silent before hanging up. Reynolds's paper, titled Temporal Anomalies in Western Frontier Disappearances, a Case Study of Dodge City, 1891 to 1892, examined the pattern of disappearances and suggested connections to similar cases in other locations and time periods. The journal that published it went out of print shortly after, and efforts to locate existing copies have been largely unsuccessful. The few remaining examples are held in private collections, their owners reluctant to allow access or reproduction. Dr. Langley herself died under unusual circumstances in 1969. While driving to meet with another researcher interested in the Cooper case, her car veered off a bridge into a river. Her body was recovered, but the briefcase containing her notes was never found. The accident was attributed to poor weather conditions, though reports indicate the day had been clear and dry. The Dodge City Historical Society maintains a small exhibit about the Vermilion Rose, though it presents the story as frontier folklore rather than documented history. The artifacts found in the basement chamber are allegedly stored in a university archive, though requests to examine them are consistently denied. Thurston's ledger was reportedly destroyed in a fire at the State Archives in 1970, though some historians suggest it was deliberately removed from the collection. Those who have delved too deeply into the story of the Vermilion Rose and the women who served more than whiskey tend to abandon their research abruptly. Academic papers on the subject remain unpublished or are withdrawn without explanation. Journalists who express interest in the case often find themselves reassigned to other stories. When asked about this pattern, most cite lack of concrete evidence or loss of interest in what they dismiss as frontier superstition. In 2011, a construction project in Denver unearthed the foundations of what records identified as a private medical facility operated by Dr. Edmund Thurston from 1897 to 1915. Among the items discovered was a brass bowl matching the description of the one used in the ritual Thurston witnessed. The bowl disappeared from the archaeological collection 3 days later, with no explanation given for its removal. The site was quickly paved over for a parking structure, further excavation deemed unnecessary by authorities. Analysis of soil samples from the site revealed unusual chemical compositions consistent with preservatives used in early medical research, along with traces of organic material that could not be precisely identified. The company contracted to analyze these samples reported that their results were inconclusive. Their laboratory suffered a power surge shortly thereafter, corrupting digital records of their findings. The physical samples were reported lost in transit when sent for secondary analysis. Perhaps most unsettling is that every few decades, reports emerge from different cities across America describing an exclusive establishment, sometimes a salon, sometimes a club, sometimes a high-end boutique, operated by a striking woman of indeterminate age accompanied by several female associates who move with unusual coordination. These establishments appear suddenly, operate for a few years during which several prominent local men disappear, and then close without notice, their proprietors vanishing without a trace. The most recent such report came from Seattle in 1964, where a members-only social club called the Crimson Parlor operated for approximately 3 years before closing suddenly. The owner, who called herself Helen Blackwood, left no forwarding address. In the months following the club's closure, authorities noted the disappearances of 3 tech industry executives, 2 prominent physicians, and a university dean. All had been regular patrons of the Crimson Parlor. None have ever been found. Police investigations stalled due to lack of evidence and jurisdictional complications. The case files remain open but inactive. A former employee of the Crimson Parlor, interviewed anonymously by a local journalist in 1965, described the owner as the most commanding presence I've ever encountered. She spoke of the woman's unusual influence over both staff and patrons, her extensive knowledge of subjects ranging from ancient history to cutting-edge science, and her peculiar habit of disappearing into a private basement room with select male guests, who would later leave through a rear exit, appearing disoriented and weakened. Most disturbing was the employee's description of the other women who worked at the club. They moved together like dancers who had rehearsed for years. They sometimes spoke in unison without seeming to coordinate. They never ate in front of others. They lived in rooms above the club and never went out alone. And their eyes, there was something wrong with their eyes. They didn't look at you. They looked through you, as if seeing something else entirely. I left after 3 months because I began to feel like they were trying to make me become like them. The owner had started inviting me to private gatherings after hours, offering me special tea that smelled bitter. I refused and gave my notice the next day. I still sometimes dream about her eyes watching me, waiting for me to return. The journalist who conducted this interview never published the full account. The article that appeared in the Seattle Inquirer on June 7, 1965, contained only vague references to unusual business practices and staff concerns about management techniques. The journalist transferred to a small newspaper in Alaska shortly afterward, citing a desire for a change of scenery. Attempts to contact him in subsequent years were unsuccessful. As you consider this account, remember that somewhere, perhaps even now, Eleanor Blackwood, or whatever name she currently uses, may be establishing a new venue in a new city. Her methods have undoubtedly evolved with the times, but her purpose likely remains unchanged. The women who work alongside her, whether willing participants or unwitting vessels, continue a tradition that has spanned centuries. The pattern continues, hidden in plain sight. Sophisticated establishments catering to successful men, proprietresses whose appearances defy the passage of time, staff who move with unsettling synchronicity, and patrons who occasionally vanish, leaving their affairs unsettled and their final whereabouts unknown. Consider the exclusive clubs, high-end spas, and invitation-only retreats that exist in every major city. Places where the wealthy and influential gather, seeking rejuvenation, connection, or escape. Places where newcomers are carefully vetted before being admitted. Places where what happens within remains private by mutual agreement. How many such establishments might serve as perfect covers for activities similar to those conducted at the Vermilion Rose? In an era of advanced medical technology and anti-aging treatments, how easily might the consumption of life essence be disguised as legitimate wellness therapies? In a society where the wealthy routinely seek to extend their lives and preserve their vitality through expensive procedures, who would question a clinic that produced remarkable results for its exclusive clientele, even if occasionally patients failed to return for follow-up appointments? The fundamental nature of predators is adaptation. They evolve to better hunt their prey, to avoid detection, to thrive in changing environments. If entities like Eleanor Blackwood and Professor Harwood have indeed existed for centuries, surviving detection and exposure, they would necessarily have adapted their methods to each new era while maintaining their essential purpose. The Frontier Saloon becomes the private club, becomes the exclusive wellness retreat, but the harvesting of life essence continues beneath the evolved facade. Should you encounter such an establishment, perhaps the wisest course would be to pass by its doors without entering. For while the whiskey they serve may burn going down, it is not nearly as dangerous as what follows. And remember, the women behind the bar may be serving far more than drinks. They may be serving a purpose that has sustained their mistress through more lifetimes than history records, a purpose requiring regular sacrifice from those who don't recognize the danger until it's far too late. The whispers of the Vermilion Rose still echo through time, carried by those who have never truly died. And somewhere, in some city, under some new name, the glasses are being filled once more.